In this video I wanted to talk about the Steyr AUG NATO, or AUG, however you want to pronounce it, but this is the NATO version. This is the one that takes AR-15 magazines, and that's the biggest thing that sells it really, is because a lot of people don't want to go out and try to look for AUG proprietary magazines, because number one, they can be expensive, about twice the price, in some cases twice the price of a regular Magpul magazine that you get with this rifle when you first get it, because I started out with this, the Steyr AUG or AUG NATO. I'll just call it an AUG, whatever, make it quicker. But I started out with the NATO version, and then I got the stock for the standard stock version. So in this video I wanted to go ahead and compare the two and kind of talk about what you're going to be, what you could possibly be looking at getting into if you go with the NATO version, and some advantages, disadvantages, just some differences between the two. So first off, it really only involves the stock, so we'll go ahead and just really talk about the stock. I mean, this is it. The trigger mechanism in the back, a little, polymer trigger mechanism, and the stock itself. So let's go ahead and get this on the table and talk about it a bit. So we have the stock on the table here, and on the right side there really isn't much distinguishing this from a standard AUG stock. Nothing's really different. You got an ejection port, you've got the grip and everything, no special controls on this side. So the one thing I will say when you actually pick this up is that the grip feels a lot fatter on the NATO stock. I don't know why, it just does. It feels fatter, like it's a little wider, and maybe a little bit more dimensionally this way. So that's one thing that I've actually felt, and it is enough to make a bit of a difference, like quite noticeable. So with that said, let's go ahead and flip it over. Ba-ding, there you go. There's the biggest noticeable differences right here. No ejection port or cover on this side. It is just a solid wall, so it's basically always going to eject out the right hand side. Is this always a disadvantage? Let's talk about that in a little bit. So, and now this is just another way of releasing the magazine. So you can grab it like this and push the button and release it that way, or you can do it the traditional way like this, and you see it activates it either way. So that's basically the difference in appearance. Now, the difference in actual function in this stock. So if you're going to go from a standard to a NATO stock, you're going to not only have to get the stock, but you're also going to have to get the trigger system that comes with it. And typically it's going to come with, obviously, the cover and the little sling swivel or whatever. So you are going to need a new trigger system. And let's go ahead and pull up the standard trigger system here. There doesn't look like there's that many differences except for in the front here. The obvious difference is this right here and the actual heads. So, and also you can see the wear on this one kind of distinguishes a little bit for the standard. So this piece right here, there's a little piece in the back of the mag well that interlocks with this for the bolt release. So when you're pushing the bolt release on the bottom inwards, it pushes this up so you can lock the bolt back just like on an AR. So that's what this is for. There is no bolt hold open. There is no, basically, the bolt hold open is the magazine for the AR, and so that's probably why this sticks out a little bit, so it can reliably lock it back. So you can see it sticks it out a bit. Let's see if I can match these up and put these on camera a little bit more fair. So it goes out a little bit more, but I think that's mostly because this has to act as its own hold open. You don't have an automatic hold open. If you want to have it automatically held open, then you got to pull it to the rear and flip up the actual charging handle. So that's basically it for the NATO. For the releasing the bolt, you got to charge the handle for the NATO. For this one, you can push the bolt release. Very simple, very intuitive, but it's not always reliable because sometimes while you're reloading, you might smack the charging handle up against something or brush it up against it, and it might release the bolt. Depending on how worn your magazines are, it might not be pushing up on this enough to get pushed fully upwards like this. It might just go partially up. just enough to touch the bolt and hold on to it, and then as soon as it gets jarred a little bit, goes down, releases the bolt. So doesn't mean that this is better just because you can push a button, because if you're using your rifle a lot like I do, you might encounter some of these weird situations, and it has happened to me plenty of times. But other than that, the trigger pulls on these are actually not very different from each other, and the surprising thing is that this one will only come with one of these little, I guess, transfer bars right here. So the good thing about the AUG trigger is because this trigger bar is all one system, or the trigger is pulled and the transfer bar is all one system. It's one. There's two little trigger bars that are, and one on each side on the standard, and on this one it's only one, but the trigger weights are the same. Kind of interesting. Some people say it might affect the trigger, but it actually doesn't. And so it moves back all in one. So as this trigger is moving, the little trigger bar is moving, or a transfer bar, or whatever you want to call it. It is all moving as one. So there's really not much of anything to kind of prevent it from working all as one. You can lubricate some of these points back here if you wish, I suppose. But, you know, for the most part, it's going to be very smooth, very crisp trigger pull. Right when you're at the wall, boop, it breaks. So it's not much different than a standard AUG trigger. Not really a disadvantage there. Now let's go ahead and talk about where this thing kind of loses points for me. In my experience, the NATO stock has been extremely finicky when it comes to reliably feeding from Steyr AUG magazines other than Magpul magazines. Even this 40 rounder, which is supposed to basically be the counterpart to the AUG's 42 rounder, which is like their LMG extended mag, which you can get for not much more than, you know, their standard 30 rounder. This thing is even a little finicky. The problem comes where these things line up. The way that the AR mags feed, this is the most like the AUG mags as far as like being in alignment with the feed ramp. For standard AUG mags, they typically put them right in line. You're not really going to have too many issues with malfunctions. With these, they're so far apart. The way that it locks in, it is just not very reliable, and it doesn't stay. So when you put these in, let me just go ahead and put this standard metal GI mag in. There is a lot of movement side to side, and it actually moves enough to actually kind of offset it from the bolt, and there's enough side to side movement. And some people would say maybe you could crank down the tension on this screw and actually pinch it. Yes, you can try to do that, but it will typically affect this hardware right here. I actually did send it into Steyr to get it fixed, and it worked for a little bit, but for the most part, it's just a design issue. It's not lined up all that well. Basically, the width of this area right here is the width of those little feed lips in the AUG mags. So let me go ahead and pull mine out as an example. So the big difference here is you can see when it's trying to feed it, this is a lot more narrow, and the actual feed lips, I'll go ahead and pull the barrel out to show you guys. As you see here, this is basically how it lines up. So the rounds are not quite on these little feed lips here, and these little ramps, they're not well aligned with these at their width. So when these rounds are typically loaded, they're a little bit off from these little feed ramps here, whereas the AUG magazine, it's pretty much right in line. So the tips are going right in line with this. The NATO is a little bit off, and it's actually brushing right here where you can see that little friction point. That's from snap caps brushing on these extreme ends. So they're basically being pushed in from there. So the only ones that are even close are the Magpul ones. They're keeping them right inside the feed lips as best they can. There are not very many magazines that are like this on the market. So unless you're using Magpul magazines, even using this one can be kind of finicky, mostly because of magazine spring tension, but you know, usually Magpul magazines are going to be your best bet, because this is not mocking the AR-15 as far as these little feed ramps. This is on its own, so you're using an AUG receiver which has the feed lips and barrel and everything in the spacing. It's just not right. So Magpul mags are the only ones that are really mocking this design, the AUG type design. So you can see they're both narrow in how they're allowing it to feed. But the big difference between this and the AUG magazines is it holds on to the brass a lot longer on the AUG mags. Other than that, it's very similar. So yeah, the AUG mags may be more expensive, but typically they're always going to be more reliable inside the AUG, and the lockup system is a lot more reliable than these. These typically are not all that reliable as far as like lockup and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, everybody's got their opinions and stuff like that. I sure as heck got mine. So anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Okay, so here you have it all put together how I would like to have it. You know, metal magazine doesn't really work out all that well, but that's kind of how it is. That's how it's kind of advertised, I guess you could say, but it does ship with Magpul mags, and you can put this 40 rounder in there. So here's the thing. You're not necessarily stuck with this NATO just as is. It's not like there's not aftermarket options for this. There is a ejection, basically a brass deflector that you can put inside the ejection port to where you can shoot this left-handed and not have the brass smashing you in the face. This thing will typically eject back to here, which is basically where these chatter marks are. That's from the brass, cutting into this. And, this is kind of tells you how much somebody has used their AUG. So if you have something like this, then you probably used it for a few thousand rounds. But that's what you'll get from like 5.56, or if you put your 223 on the higher gas setting, then typically you'll get those little chatter marks. And I'm trying to build up mine on my standard NATO stock, but Corvus Defensio makes brass deflectors and a lot of stuff for the AUG. So you can get a lot of modifications done. You can get a lot of things done to your AUG that whether it's NATO or standard. So if you have a crap load of Magpul mags, or you just don't want to have to switch over, then the NATO is actually a nice option. That is up to you. It is going to cost you a little bit more, but overall you're not really losing out on all too much, except for the controls. You're not going to have that bolt release. You're going to have to rack it in order to get that first round in. There's little sacrifices you're going to have to make here and there for it. So as long as you're aware of that, it's all going to be fine. But the one thing I will say that I do like about the NATO over the standard is, I'm going to go ahead and pull my standard stock to kind of show you guys what I'm talking about. But I do like that I don't have to have a cover for the other side. Now what I mean by this is this cover has slid off so many times. It doesn't take very much. If you go on InRange TV, when they did the mud test on the AUG, this cover actually slid off. Basically you just pull it up a little bit and you slide it. I took electrical tape and I actually wrapped from the inside, and you can see a little bit of that electrical tape. I wrapped it around the little nub that kind of goes inside that little metal sleeve and locks in there. So I have a little bit of electrical tape still sticking there, and it doesn't get in the way or anything, but that's just to hold tension to hold this on. That's one of the things I absolutely hate, is how they did not figure this system out to make it to where it's not going to slide and screw around on you. But yeah, of course, you can see here, not much of a difference. Got a little electrical tape right here for grip, because it's kind of a small grip compared to this one. But yeah, there's really not much difference except for bolt release. Kind of a, it doesn't really have all that much value if you have like weaker AUG mags, because this isn't going to lock open all that reliably. But as far as it's not going to hold up very tight as much as a fresh AUG mag would hold it open. So with all that said, that's the difference between the AUG and the standard stock. But overall, it's not necessarily a bad option, but I think if you go into it understanding you know, what all the disadvantages or preparation, all the different disadvantages are and all the preparations you might want to make, I think you can actually make an educated decision on whether you want to invest a little bit more getting some standard AUG mags, or if you want to spend a couple $100 but be able to retain the magazines you're already using. Realistically, you may be spending a couple $100 more, but you're going to be spending a couple $100, if not more, trying to get a collection of AUG mags. And also, you might be dealing with crap you don't want to deal with. So, is the Steyr AUG NATO stock, you know, an option for you? I think it is. I'm glad that I still have mine around because it's a good little thing to go back to. As long as I got magazines that are functioning properly, I don't really have too many complaints. But except for the manual of arms is going to be a little bit different if you like using a bolt release. You know, there really isn't all that much that it's a big disadvantage. So with all that said, go ahead and leave your comments below if you have any experience with this. And I will see you guys in another video.